Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thanks again for joining me for this third in a series of lectures on the traditional religious narrative and counter-narrative as presented by the scholar Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. Now, for those of you who have watched the first two sessions, I'm not going to go through a full summary, but at least give you a sense of where we're jumping off from in the last session that you may have just listened to. But before I do that, let me also give you a little bit background with regard to Javed Ghamidi for those who may not fully know him, and maybe you're picking this up as for the first time where you're getting introduced to him. Now, there's plenty of stuff on the internet that you can read about him, but by way of background, he is a Pakistani thinker, scholar, religious scholar, theologian, an exegete of the Quran. He's written a commentary of the Quran. There's two major works, one would say. He's written many things, but his two major works is a 5-volume Quran commentary called Al-Bayan. And then he has a book that is his magnum opus, if you will, that covers a variety of topics from akhlaqiyat, ethics, and sort of law, from theology, law, ethics, wisdom, hikmah, a bunch of things. The totality of the faith, if you will, called Meezan. So those are his two main works, written in the Urdu language, which is the primary language in which he writes, or really the only language. He does have some earlier works in Arabic, but shorter pieces. But it's really in Urdu where he's sort of operating primarily. He, of course, knows Urdu language. He knows Arabic incredibly well, Farsi, and a few other languages as well. So that's his background from a scholarly standpoint, just as a brief introduction to that. At the same time, one of the things that I tried to explain previously, but to give you a sense of the rich intellectual journey he's been on, people oftentimes know about his relationship as a student of Amin and Islahi, who's a major Quran commentator and scholar in the 20th century India and Pakistan, as well as the sort of other great thinker and scholar, Maulana Maududi, or influential scholar. In addition to that, his initial journey in life with regard to religion was growing up in a family that was heavily Sufi, right? That was part of a Sufi tariqah, his father having a very prominent role as a murid to a sheikh, a peer, if you will. And for that reason, his father had actually encouraged Ghamidi Sahib to learn Arabic and Persian at a very early age in order to access some of these texts. He saw in his son this interest in learning and reading in particular, and encouraged that by trying to get him to engage with these languages. And as a result, at a very early stage, Ghamidi Sahib immersed himself in a lot of Sufi literature, which was really the literature of his household and the sort of early community he is a part of. So, in many respects, and he says it himself, that this is the earth that he came from, the Sufi dirt in some respects, right? In the best of ways that we think of the earth that we are from. So that's his background. And that makes a connection with what we had just spoken about in the previous lecture, or I had just spoken about in the previous lecture, which was Imam Ghazali. So we had started to talk in the previous lecture about the set of scholars in Islamic history that have prominence not because they are specialists in any particular area, but because they are articulating a broader, wider vision of religion. In Ghamidi Saab's view, there are these scholars that have essentially been the major constructors of the religious narrative and the religious vision that has come to have the most profound influence over the Muslim world. And he says the first and most prominent of those is Imam Ghazali, who put forward essentially a Sufi vision that is part and parcel of his own experience that eventually arrived at that Sufi place. And there, that vision has had longevity unlike any of the other visions, which are also incredibly influential, but not quite the way of this vision. The personality, so Imam Ghazali is the first influencer, constructor of this vision, of a vision for the faith as a whole. The second one in Ghamidi Saab's view is someone by the name of Ibn Taymiyya. He's the next major personality. And his approach is a little bit different than Imam Ghazali. He's an incredibly influential scholar, especially in knowledge circles within Islamic history. It's incredibly influential. In fact, there's a saying that Ghamidi Saab mentions about Ibn Taymiyya, which says, if there's a hadith that Ibn Taymiyya says he doesn't know, then it's likely not a hadith. In other words, his knowledge was so immense, so encyclopedic, so vast, that it could not be possible that a hadith exists and Ibn Taymiyya does not know about it. That's the type of status and level he had. And he's hugely influential for generations. And yet, despite that, in some respects, he is unable to break the charm of Imam Ghazali and his Sufi vision among the people. He's hugely influential. But for Ghamidi Saab, he doesn't quite end up having as vast a popular influence as Imam Ghazali. But he writes a tremendous amount and some incredibly important works. He writes a critique, a response to the people of his time, the philosophers who were putting forward mantiq and logic as a key sort of philosophical sort of oversight over the faith. And what he puts forward as his vision is what Ghamidi Saab characterizes as really the Salafi vision, right? The Salafi approach, the Salafi interpretation. Again, like Imam Ghazali, this approach, this vision was present before Ibn Taymiyya. It's not the originator, just like Imam Ghazali is not the originator of the Sufi vision. But Ibn Taymiyya does what Imam Ghazali did for the Sufi vision. He makes it coherent. He puts it together. Now, in the process, Ibn Taymiyya, as part of the Salafi vision, is scathing in his critique of that other vision, that Sufi vision. As Ghamidi Saab points out in his lectures, Ibn Taymiyya says Imam Ghazali dove into philosophy and never came back, never emerged, never resurfaced. He critiques him for even going down that route of trying to respond to the philosophers by understanding them and etc. and going into kalam and all this stuff. Likewise, he's even more fierce with regard to Ibn Arabi, somebody who Ghamidi Sahib actually spent an early part of his early sort of scholarly journey teaching Ibn Arabi. But Ibn Taymiyya refers to Ibn Arabi as the Dajjal among the Dajjals. Right? Really severe critique. But at the heart of this vision, of the Salafi vision that Ibn Taymiyya puts forward, is that they take the Quran and Sunnah as the base, of course, right? But they do something else. That they take the companions, the Sahaba, the successors, the Tabi'een, they take their thoughts, their ideas, their practices as the basis, the criterion by which they are going to assess religion. They take the perspective of the first generation and they assess the faith on that basis. That is how Ghamidi Sahib encompasses or encapsulates what the Salafi vision is. Why do they do that? Because in that Salafi vision that Ibn Taymiyya puts forward, these folks, the Sahaba, the companions, the Tabi'een, the successors, they are directly learning from the Prophet, peace be upon him. They're directly learning from him. And that gives them access to insight about the faith that others simply cannot have in the same way. So the Salafi vision wants to know, how did these folks, this first generation, see society? How did they interpret the Quran? How did they place different things within the faith? Ghamidi Sahib says. These are the questions, Ghamidi Sahib notes, that the Salafi vision is trying to answer or trying to discover. What was their organization of society like? And in that sense then, what Ghamidi Sahib contends is that the first generation, the companions, the successors, essentially become a source of religion. A source of religion. That it's not simply the Quran and the Sunnah, but really the historical record of what the companions and successors did or said or thought, or the ideas they had, that itself becomes a source. One in which you can hang your arguments on. That's a major development. And Salafi, of course, as Ghamidi Sahib notes, and many of you may know, Salaf, these are the Salaf, the first generation. They are the Salaf. That's why this vision is the Salafi vision. And so they essentially say all that comes after this first generation, the philosophy from the Greeks, etc., the Sufi approach, all of that is secondary, it's wasteful, it's rejected. What matters is that first generation. We don't need to know how the Greeks in their philosophical thinking think about religion and theology and all these ideas. We don't need this kalam, theology, all of that. We don't need this Sufi approach. Did the Sahaba have it? Did the Tabi'een have it? If they didn't have it, we don't need it. That's the Salafi vision that Ibn Taymiyya puts forward. And in essence, that vision floats in intellectual circles and only gains a public foothold for real after it becomes the interpretive approach that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab introduces into the Arabian Peninsula. That is when this Salafi vision gets brought forward to a wider audience. Before that, it's influential at the scholarly level, but for Ghamidi Saab, it is that moment, 1917 and subsequent, where Ibn Abdul Wahhab essentially forms a pact with the Saud family in Saudi Arabia to say, you all can have political power, let us determine the religious vision of this state. And that vision is the Salafi vision. And since that time, and that pact exists, continues to exist, right? Or that understanding, however you want to think of it. And since that time, that vision, with the introduction of the oil wealth in Saudi Arabia, was able to be exported and sent to other parts of the world. And it led to a major impact of the Salafi vision and interpretation around the world. From the United States to parts of South Asia, East Asia, the Arab world, Africa, all over. All over. That is the Salafi vision. Subsequent to Ibn Taymiyya, Ghamidi Saab introduces us to who he believes is the third major personality. The third major personality that constructs a religious vision, a holistic religious vision for the faith. And that is Shah Wali Ullah. Shah Wali Ullah, who lived in India, who was in a period where he comes after much time after Ibn Taymiyya, becomes the next major personality who puts forward a holistic approach. He's deeply knowledgeable. As Ghamidi Saab notes, he's a Sufi, but he's also a big hadith scholar. He knows kalam, he knows philosophy. He in fact wrote some commentaries on the Muwatta. And his real major work is Hujjat al-Balagha. In this work, you find the Sufi vision, but you also find the Ibn Taymiyya vision, particularly with regard to the importance of the Quran and Sunnah and the first generation as an access point to the Quran and Sunnah. You find both, which is, as Ghamidi Saab notes, not unusual for Shah Wali Ullah. Shah Wali Ullah's work, he says, is particularly known for trying to find points of convergence between different intellectual trends. He does this even within Sufism itself. Within Sufism, at one stage there was, I won't go into much detail, but Ghamidi Saab notes that there was this, the idea of wahdat al-wujud and wahdat al-shuhud, this sort of distinction between sort of the essence and reality of God that started to spark some debates. And what Shah Wali Ullah does is takes pains to show that actually they're just the same thing. So his vision, part of his vision is to show and point out these convergences in intellectual trends and ideas and concepts that people think of as different. And he does this with the Sufi and Salafi vision, providing a type of synthesis. And his book, Hujjat al-Balagha, is a unique book in Muslim history, because he also introduces within it many ideas, many things from within fiqh and hadith that people were just unaware of. In fact, Ghamidi Saab notes that some of the ideas that Ghamidi Saab himself has put forward, that sometimes he's even been kind of critiqued on, that some of those ideas you actually find originated within, or you find them within Shah Wali Ullah. Maybe in a more basic form, but you find them there. The idea, for instance, Ghamidi Sahib's view that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was essentially a reviver of the sunnah of Millat Ibrahim, of Ibrahim's community, the Prophet Ibrahim's community, radiyallahu anhu. That he was a reviver of that. That idea is present in Shah Wali Ullah's work. Likewise, Ghamidi Sahib's idea of what the sunnah is, you find that basic concept and idea in Shah Wali Ullah's work. It's more extensively elaborated and discussed in Ghamidi Sahib's Meezan, but you find that core idea in Shah Wali Ullah. So part of the unique thing about this book in Hujjat al-Balagha is that it has so many nuggets of discovery that people just didn't know about before, which is why it has been hugely influential and drawn so many people to it. And in some respects, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, the religious movement that is probably the biggest, largest, and most influential in the Muslim world arises out of the intellectual legacy of Shah Wali Ullah, and that is the Deoband. The Deobandi school, the Deobandi movement arises out of that. And the Deoband touch many major figures, particularly in the world of jihad. They take influence from the Deoband, and the Deoband takes influence from Shah Wali Ullah. And his main contribution, his main virtue, the main component of his vision is this convergence, the creation of almost a unity between the Sufi and the Salafi visions. Finally, the fourth personality. So we've talked about Imam Ghazali and the Sufi vision. We've talked about Ibn Taymiyya and the Salafi vision. We've talked about Shah Wali Ullah and the convergence that he brings about between the Sufi and the Salafi vision. And then we have Maulana Mawdudi. Maulana Mawdudi is the fourth personality that in Javed Ghamidi's view is a constructor of religious vision and the all-encompassing narrative. And he takes an interesting approach. Maulana Mawdudi doesn't critique Tasawwuf Sufism. He just kind of ignores it, Ghamidi Sahib says. And in essence, he really just is taking on or embracing the Salafi vision and taking it one step further, one step forward. He takes the Salafi approach and begins to apply it to all different parts of the faith. And he gives it a new look. And I would offer, and I think that Ghamidi Sahib might agree, that Maududi is also unique because he exists as an influencer in a world that looks drastically different than anything that has existed in the Islamic past. Maududi comes and exists at a point of rupture with Islamic civilization. He comes at a point where Muslim power is gone, where Islamic civilization as we knew it has now faced the wrath of colonialism. That's where he comes in. And he gives the Salafi vision a new look. And what's that look? He puts forward what can be called the political interpretation, the political vision of Islam. And that vision becomes hugely influential. The Muslim Brotherhood, across the Arab world, Southeast Asia, South Asia, for the younger generation in his time period and the decades after. This political vision, this idea of thinking of Islam in political terms comes about at a time when Muslims are pining, are having nostalgia for a past where they actually held political power. Maududi, and here I may offer my own idea, puts forward a vision for how to return to that time of power, of political power. And so he becomes hugely influential. There was a desire to see this revival. The poets like Muhammad Iqbal and others were articulating it. And you begin to see Maududi's influence everywhere. Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian thinker, hugely influential. You see where he's picking up Maududi's ideas and incorporating them into his own thought. Maududi ends up oftentimes being a source of those who are thinking about Islam in political terms, or political Islam, if you will. To the extent that Ghamidi Sahib says that even his critics, even his fiercest critics, adopt Maududi's language to speak about the collective space, about society, about organizing the system. So that's who these folks are. For Ghamidi Sahib, Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyya, Shah Wali Ullah, Maulana Maududi. These four people see the interconnectedness within the faith. They're not just specialists. They see the interconnectedness and from that put forward a vision of the faith as a whole. And in that respect, from the standpoint of influence, they are arguably, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, just as influential, if not more at times, than even the four major imams at the head of the Sunni schools of law. Now, Ghamidi Sahib notes that they have many differences. I've just explained some of them in these last few episodes. Right? They have many differences. But when it comes to their religious narrative that is motivating people as it relates to the state, to a great extent, Ghamidi Sahib says, it's actually very much the same. There's actually not much difference. Despite different views on various rulings, etc., they're actually on the same page with regard to this narrative of religion and the state. So these four major influencers of the visions of the faith, of these holistic visions of the faith, four different visions, that when it comes to the relationship of religion and the state, the narrative constructed around that, these four major influencers all come together on the same page, and that is the creation of the traditional narrative. In the next series of lectures, we'll go through the main points in this narrative and get at the heart of what it is that they are actually on the same page on. And then from there, move on to the counter-narrative that Ghamidi Saab offers himself. I look forward to continuing the journey with you. Wa akhir ad-dawa walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.